I hear you. I hear you. That's going to be fun. Have you been to an ISA conference before?
No, because the last
Lovely. I wish Carrie was here so we could thank her in person, but I'm sure you noticed the new adornments out in front commemorating Lynn and the Nobel, which is a lovely way to celebrate that too. But this is going to be fantastic today, Britt. Thank you so much, Anna, for commemorating. Yeah, terrific.
Go ahead and get started so we can have all the time that we want. I'm just going to stand here because I saw that I wasn't in view of the camera. Welcome to those in person and online. Today, Britt Koehnlein is going to be presenting her wonderful work. Britt is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science here at IU and an Ostrom Fellow this year. Her research focuses on civil conflict, epidemics, and climate change with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Britt has published a co-authored article about the effects of COVID-19 on state capacity and violence by non-state actors in the Journal of Peace Research, and a co-authored article on environmental variability and conflict in Population and Environment. She's also shared the findings from her research in policy-relevant publications for the Stimson Center and Political Violence at a Glance. And she was recently interviewed for the Provost's 5 Questions with series. So if you want to learn a little bit more about Britt, you can check that out.
That's actually really good.
Her dissertation is focused on understanding the relationship between vaccination campaigns and state legitimacy and capacity, particularly in states that are experiencing or have recently experienced civil conflict. Britt holds a bachelor in French and Religious Studies from IU Indianapolis and a master in Political Science from Ball State University. And today she will present for us a paper titled Building Symbolic Capacity Building Legitimacy by Leveraging the Polycentricity of Vaccination Campaigns. And I look forward to a rousing discussion after her presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to mention, Britt, this will be at ISA, right? Next week. So part of the point of this is to give feedback.
So I am bringing this paper literally a week from today to ISA. And so I really welcome your feedback on this. Also, just generally, thank you to the Ostrom workshop. My research has evolved so much since I've started coming here and the class, and thank you, Dan, for all of that. This is ongoing research, as you could tell from the paper, and this is also my first real stab at qualitative analysis. So I have any feedback that you have for me on that would be greatly appreciated. It is a chapter of my dissertation, but again, at pretty early stages, so we're still working on it. We could get, I have a clicker that hopefully works.
Yeah.
Doing great. So, like Ariana said, my research focuses a lot on civil conflict. And as I'm sure we all know from just reading the news and other literatures, states experiencing conflict face a variety of challenges. One of these is building their material capacity. On top of this, exogenous shocks such as natural disasters, floods, droughts, climate change, agriculture problems, epidemics, these all pose detrimental problems for these states. As we've seen, the recent global pandemic and severe climate change have highlighted weak states' inability to mitigate against these shocks and then address them once they've occurred. Weak states are also then the most at risk for this concurrence of civil conflict and exogenous shocks. And under these conditions, a lot of these states end up sort of trapped in this cycle of conflicts, epidemics, and continued weakness. So improving material capacity allows for many things, which include responsiveness to citizens, transparency, physical integrity rights protections, economic gains and improvements, et cetera, et cetera. The list is pretty endless. Weak states, however, frequently are unable to improve their capacity due to, again, a variety of factors, including limited resources, poor infrastructure, an inability to consolidate power, and a lack of control and violence. And these things are often also all related and intertwined, and so it's hard to escape this. And a lot of times when these states try to improve in one policy area, such as education, they're then pulling resources away from building infrastructure or healthcare, et cetera. So I've been trying to sort of untangle how weak states could that first improve legitimacy and capacity before going on to build this material capacity. And I I believe and have seen that epidemics are offering this sort of rare opportunity for states to face these challenges and improve legitimacy through a vaccination campaign. So my overarching research question is, how and when do vaccination campaigns help improve state legitimacy in these conflict-ridden states? For those of you that are not as steeped in this literature as I am, material capacity and legitimacy are very hard to define terms. Everyone has a different definition. There is no consensus in the literature. For the purposes of this paper and for my own research, and at least where I'm at in the research, I am understanding material capacity as a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, the ability of the state to repress, and whether the state has a functioning bureaucracy and administration. I am then defining legitimacy, the ability of the state to engender and maintain belief that the existing political institutions are the most appropriate ones for society and that the state is the most appropriate for society. So the broad theoretical path that I'm seeing here is that vaccination campaigns are bolstering legitimacy. States need some way to show citizens that they're capable and viable despite material limitations. And so they can partner with international organizations and local leaders to make this happen. And these partnerships are providing both logistical and symbolic benefits for the state, whether that's resources, local knowledge. In terms of the World Health Organization, they're like the highest form of health knowledge and health expertise. Local leaders are going to know much more about their citizens, the terrain, where people live, who needs what and when, and all of these types of things. So I'm understanding this as vaccinations being short-term service provision to help improve legitimacy to then lay the foundation for improved material capacity. And so I see this as a multi-tiered, polycentric service provision. And there's a lot happening in that terminology. So hopefully we can break this down. So service provision, it can be very complicated, again, in these states with limited resources and poor infrastructure. And we know that states will often set up service provision efforts. They'll set up rules, they'll set up regulations, but these can often be very rudimentary and these can often be halted or stalled, or the services will change or they won't be as effective. And so in these weak and fragmented states, it can be better for them to partner with local leaders who are more knowledgeable about local citizens and also have the presence in the area to provide these services. And so they can be the bridge between the state and citizens. And then on top of that, weak states are then going to have to, for things like vaccination campaigns, partner with international organizations for these material and personnel resources. Then on top of this, because now we're in a state that's in conflict, some of these states are going to have to partner or at least sort of tolerate, work with, etc., rebel leaders or formal rebel leaders. In a lot of these instances, rebel groups have partial or total control of certain areas, and they are often already providing services. And so when you're trying to conduct something like a vaccination campaign, you're going to have to work with those leaders that are already providing some of these services to try and prevent an increase in violence. So I hypothesize that states in conflict that are able to partner effectively with actors at various levels of these polycentric governance structures during a vaccination campaign are more likely to increase their legitimacy than those states who are not able to do this, which is a different hypothesis than what was in the paper if you read it. I have struggled a lot with how I'm hypothesizing this. And so this is just sort of a run at this hypothesis to see how you like it. So I'm using the Democratic Republic of the Congo as a most likely case. The DRC has been enmeshed in civil conflict since independence. This isn't one long civil conflict. This has been many civil conflicts throughout the state. Most of the conflict and fighting today is based in the east, but there are pockets of violence that still occur all over the country. Part of this was that the country was under a brutal dictatorship under Mobutu from 1965 to 2001. And then when they finally held democratic elections in 2001 and President Kabila was elected, he then was some would say no better than the dictator that they had just been under. Kabila was accused of rampant human rights abuses, disappearances, torture, restrictions on civil liberties, and journalistic infringement. One other piece of this puzzle is that the DRC is very resource rich, but ultimately very poor due to corrupt politicians, poor infrastructure, a long history of all of these problems, and then extractive foreign powers and companies. They haven't been able to use the resources to their advantage. So I am looking at, that is very hard to read. I'm so sorry. So this is all of the DRC. I'm particularly interested in this province here, Equator province. That actually used to be, in 2015 was all of this area. And so it's quite a large region of the country and has experienced quite a few pockets of violence itself. So Equator province, the most recent experience it had with widespread violence was during the Second Congo War, which was from 1998 to 2003. This was spearheaded by the Movement for the Liberation of Congo. This group strategically picked Equator province to base its headquarters because the region was very poor. It's very sparsely populated. It's in a dense jungle. And so its service provision was basically non-existent. And so they chose this area because they could go in, provide basic services, and the population would sort of house and protect them from the central government. When the war ended, the MLC did transform into a political party. This has been rife with problems for them, and they've maintained their opposition status quite strongly. And even though their power has sort of waned in the region in the last decade, they still remain very powerful and very popular to citizens there. There's also currently a mostly nonviolent rebellion in the south of the region, and this is by the Independent Movement of Liberation and Allies. This group is connected to quite a few other rebel groups throughout the country, but they don't tend to commit acts of violence in Equator province, but they are important in the region as a service provider. This province, like I said, is sparsely populated, but it is along the Congo River, and so it provides an important hub for trade and migration, especially between Congo and Central African Republic. Another piece of this puzzle, because of course there's many pieces to this puzzle, is that funerals in the DRC and burial customs, as well as in some neighboring states, are of particular concern to the states and to the WHO when there is an epidemic, because these funeral customs include frequent interactions with and touching of body. And especially in the case of Ebola, you can still transmit Ebola after death. And so these processes include washing the body, putting perfumes on the body, holding mourning rituals where everyone is touching the body, and then dressing it. And this can last for 2 to 3 days. And so you have many people, family, friends that are in and around the home in very close quarters with an ill person for, again, 2 to 3 days before the funeral. This practice cuts across religious and ethnic groups. And so these practices make mitigation efforts more difficult, but also much more important to address when you are conducting a vaccination campaign. We're going to skip the table because I'm about to go through the 4 outbreaks, which are my evidence. I'm trying to unpack these mechanisms of how this is working on the ground. And so I'm looking at 4 outbreaks in this province of Ebola since 2014. So the first outbreak occurred again in 2014 in August, and the state notified the WHO that they suspected an Ebola outbreak. This was happening concurrently to the outbreak in West Africa, which was in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and somewhere else, in Liberia. And what they ended up figuring out is that it was a completely different strain. So the DRC was actually the first country to ever experience Ebola in 1976, and it was that original strain that had appeared again in 2014. They did attempt to use the vaccines that they were using in West Africa. They'd had minimal effectiveness in West Africa, but very limited effectiveness against the strain that was happening in the DRC at the time. So this breakdown in state-citizen relations happened in sort of three main ways. The first is that the state tried to impose very strict restrictions on citizens without attempting to inform them of why these restrictions were necessary. They were putting up curfews that citizens didn't understand. They were limiting how many people could meet in groups. And the citizens, again, just didn't understand why this was necessary. The state also tried to force vaccinations on people. So they would go into homes and just try to vaccinate them with these experimental vaccines. Part of the problem with that is that because the vaccines were fairly ineffective, people who got them also ended up contracting Ebola and dying. And so citizens were watching the state force vaccinations that then led to these people's death. And a lot of misinformation ended up spreading about how Ebola is spread. And there were rumors that Ebola, the vaccine was causing Ebola, or anyway, it was very huge misinformation about it. The third part of this breakdown is that they were demanding changes in funeral practices. So instead of working with citizens and again, explaining to them why this was necessary, they would set up sites with the WHO and Doctors Without Borders, and then bodies straight from the hospital to these funeral sites, completely skipping the family. And so families actually started stealing bodies of family members from hospitals so that they could do a proper burial. And they were also then hiding sick family members or not reporting sick family members. And it led to this just rapid transmission of Ebola. So because of this breakdown, overall, it had no or maybe even worsened citizen perceptions of state legitimacy. And then we get to 2018. So in 2018, the state realized that 2014 went horribly wrong. And so the first thing that they did after contacting the WHO was they reached out to local leaders. And this included both local politicians from the MLC and religious leaders. And then they addressed some of the problems in three different ways. The first way that they did this is they did a huge information campaign. They, with the help of the WHO, printed out cards of what Ebola would look like in an infected person. And they had information about how it spreads, why it's dangerous, and all of these things related to Ebola in multiple languages so that everyone could get the information that they needed. They also began a vaccination campaign about 2 weeks after the outbreak started. And this time they used, so by the end of the outbreak in West Africa in 2016, they had created a much more effective vaccine. And so when they began the vaccination campaigns in May of 2018, it was actually effective. And so citizens this time could see that when someone was vaccinated, they were much safer than they had been 4 years ago. They also worked with the local leaders to help citizens with burial practices and changes. And so instead of forcing them to go to these sites, they would try and set up in their homes a safer method of dressing and cleaning and getting the body ready for burial. By the end, or by about mid-July, citizens were voluntarily getting vaccinated and were voluntarily bringing deceased family members to the funeral sites and not bringing them back to their homes. And so because the state was able to show that it, maybe cared is the wrong word, but the state was aware enough to put in these efforts, citizen perceptions of legitimacy of the state did increase. They saw that the state was willing to work with people that they trusted to keep them safe. By the end of, or by mid-2020, another outbreak occurred Because this province is a dense jungle and a lot of these villages are very remote, most of these start with citizens eating bush meat. So this is why we've had so many outbreaks in this province. But by the time the outbreak happened in 2020, a lot of citizens had actually maintained some of the adjusted funeral practices. And when the outbreak occurred, the state immediately, again, partnered with local leaders, the WHO, and started basically rejuvenated the information campaign to make sure that citizens understood this is exactly what we did 2 years ago, and here's how we can kind of mitigate against this. So the state had a much easier time conducting the vaccination campaigns and helping citizens adjust funeral practices. By 2022, when an outbreak occurred, there were only 5 total infections. All 5 people did die, but they were able to quarantine them so quickly that they were able, and the vaccinations had been so effective that people were kept much safer by 2022. And so the state this time was able to maintain or even maybe slightly improve perceptions of legitimacy. Because the state had been able to deliver effective services in 2018, citizens were much more trusting them by 2020. So by partnering with international organizations and local leaders, the state was better able to understand the needs and concerns of citizens and address them accordingly. The outbreak in 2014 was more deadly, and the state again struggled to communicate effectively with citizens because it was skipping over these citizens trusted. They changed their tactics in 2018, and so the state was able to conduct more effective vaccination campaign. They were able to help citizens adjust funeral practices, and they were able to improve their legitimacy. This then facilitated a less deadly outbreak and a more effective vaccination campaign in both 2020 and 2022. Equator province today, or since 2020, has seen slight improvements in other types of service provision and has had a slightly better relationship with the state overall. So again, this presentation, it's one chapter of my dissertation, and I am currently working on building a global data set of vaccination campaigns because I'm interested in how these dynamics sort of work globally. And then investigating additional cases, I realized that one province of one country isn't necessarily going to be able to exploit all of these differences. Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Britt. So now we'll open it up to both those here in the room and also online. I'll keep my eye on the chat online, or if anyone who's watching wants to use the raise hand function, I'll add you to the queue. Take it away.
As you know, I've seen previous versions of that, and it's getting much better each time. So it's very good. This will make a good presentation at ISA if you make the font a little bigger. Bigger if you get one of those giant rooms.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions. I think I'll just ask one at this time, and then maybe come back in later. It seems to me that what's interesting here, then you just sort of skip right past, is that something happened between 2014 and 2018. And you don't really talk about that. And I think moving forward, that's probably something you would want to look at a little bit, and you may sort of be prepared for some questions along that line. Because one of the things that happened has sort of a pretty obvious sort of role here. They had a better vaccine. And the policymakers here, the Congo state, we didn't have anything to do with that. Well, that was global research programs that gave vaccine and stuff. But there's a possibility, and you got to get to it, that some of the policymakers learned something in 2014, 2018. They didn't go right in and try to force people to take it. I mean, it helped they had a better vaccine, but they also weren't forcing people to take it. They weren't forcing changes in the funeral practice. So have you seen any evidence of how that policy learning took place in the Congo state or the local or provincial officials? Was it the same officials involved that learned something? Was it different officials? Because And then the 2020 is just sort of more of the same, more better sort of the same. So what do you have any sense of what was because one of the important components of state capacity is the capacity to learn from mistakes, and governments aren't always good at that. So why did that work so well?
So I've been digging through news releases from the DRC about especially the 2014 case to see if policymakers or even the president admitted any faults in 2014, and there is some radio silence there. So now I need to start going through the 2018 releases to see if there's any suggestion that 2014 impacted them. As of now, it seems like their response is just 2014 didn't go well. Let's do something different. There doesn't seem to be any specific mention that they did it wrong in 2014. And so maybe that's just politicians not wanting to admit faults, or maybe just haven't found the right person.
Or you saying you looked at 2014 and 18, but you didn't look at what was happening in between?
Correct.
Whether there were statements in between, because that might be sort of where they started talking about it. And another thing to look at is it may not be that the policymakers figured this out on their own, but some of these global there's international organizations, Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, and all those guys, they conducted some sort of after studies. And so you may want to look at what sort of evidence they have. And so the policymakers may have had, they may have maintained contacts, not the president, look at the president's office, but who's ever sort of doing the public health stuff.
Okay.
If there is anybody doing the public health stuff there. Who they were working with and whether there was some sort of conference or reports that were given or connections and them. And again, so that's just sort of more for sort of future kind of research. But to me, as a policy analyst, that's sort of the key thing that's missing here, that it wasn't just a better vaccine. It was somehow the government was doing something better, and why and why can't they do that more often?
Yeah.
I have a 2-second question on that, and it's to both of you. There must be a political consequence for admitting you're working with the rebel groups, right? It's not my area, but I would assume so. Is there a reason that she'll never find this information because they don't want to reveal that we worked with rebel group X, not rebel group Y? And
so sometimes it can help the government to admit that they've been working with rebel groups, because then other rebel groups can see that the state is willing to also sort of come to the table and work with them. In terms of the MLC, it's kind of tricky because now they're a political opposition party, and they are a little bit unique in that sense. Maybe not fully unique, but they're really interesting. But they go up against the state party. And so I think, but again, there's that idea of coming to the table with opposition parties. And so I'll have to look more into when that hurts a state to admit that and when it helps them to admit that.
Especially in this context.
Yeah.
And then a 2-second follow-up. Has someone introduced you to Cyan?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Just double checking that obvious connection's been made. Okay, cool.
Okay.
Scott?
Oh yeah.
So this is, it'll be pretty brief. And first off, great job.
Yeah.
That was wonderful. Just thinking about ISA, next week, just a few kind of high level comments. The first one, you might want to pay, and I'd love to hear Dan and Mike's, among others, thoughts on this, but maybe a little more attention up front to kind of highlighting the role you see polycentricity in particular playing in this analysis. Like what heavy lifting is that doing for you? What maybe highlight some of the potential, downsides or friction points of relying on that. I'm thinking about Mike's work in the healthcare system here in the US, but maybe this is a very different example, very different cultural context, but trying to tease that out a little bit more, I think could be helpful, and it could help you get in front of some questions. And I also immediately, and this is just me coming at this very fresh, what came to mind was like what happened in kind of the Pakistan-Afghan border after the whole Bin Laden hunt, and then kind of weaponizing some of the nonprofits by the CIA to basically do some of that intel gathering and what that did to trust and legitimacy for some of those campaigns like that Rotary was doing against polio at the time. So I'm just kind of wondering, this is a very different context, but obviously there are still a lot of other intel operations. Clearly, you know, the Department of Defense, among others, doesn't have the best reputation in this part of Africa. So I'm wondering if there are any dynamics as you're starting to think about these global population and more data sets to think through how, you know, kind of what the legacies are of that type of, you know, weaponization, for lack of a better term, of these campaigns, and how that could play into trust and legitimacy. Maybe that's one reason that's driving more governments for not working more closely with nonprofits, especially Western nonprofits. I don't know. That just dynamic came to mind, and I would love to hear, like I said, thoughts on that. I didn't see too much of that. That might be other parts of your dissertation, but I thought that could be a useful thing to tee up a little bit to kind of do a bit of a comparison there.
Yeah.
Can I make a one finger on that? For an ISA audience, give yourself some credit here. Take some credit for expanding the definition of state capacity in the way it's usually used.
I like that.
Into, as I think I commented before, you know, being able to work and play well with others. Okay, and not usually part of the state capacity sort of thing, is to be able to connect, and that's where the polycentricity comes in. That you're really looking at polycentricity as a way towards a more effective governance, and you're incorporating that into your definition of state capacity, which is not the way most of the people in that audience are going to hear it. They're going to think of the bureaucracy.
Okay, well, we'll turn to a couple questions in the Zoom room. Tonya, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Would you like to say your question now?
Oh, you're muted.
You're still on mute.
Great to see you.
Clearly, I haven't used Zoom in this capacity in a while.
Well,
so yeah. First off, I mean, Britt, awesome presentation. You know, I've seen the work develop, and I really think you're on like a really cool track, and I think it's going well, and it's just going to get better and better, and it's already great. So, like, kudos, seriously. So, one thing I kind of wanted to touch on was, it seems to me from your story that this whole partnering with local leaders thing is like kind of the really key big difference between these cases that you're looking at. And I was kind of thinking about it. I'm wondering if there were certain conditions going on right before 2014 that maybe made this an impossible strategy for the state to use in the first place. So maybe thinking about like why didn't they try this at that point is kind of what I'm thinking, but then tried it in 2018. So it's kind of getting at a previous comment, which I couldn't really see who it was, so sorry, but that's like what's happening like between these events that kind of like altered the circumstances and the strategies that were used. So yeah, like that would be really interesting to tease out. And I mean, just from my perspective, like I think the whole local partnership thing a really cool like contribution here. And that kind of disaggregation of like, you know, logistical efforts for a vaccination campaign is a really, I think, cool point of variation to try and exploit here. And yeah, I mean, you know, there's like lots of literature in sub-Saharan Africa on like the role of local leaders and like just how that can help, you know, central state efforts for things. So yeah, but that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You want to respond?
Real quickly, what's kind of interesting is that the MLC actually had most of its problems in 2016 and 2017, and the leader of the party was brought up on human rights abuse charges himself. And so I don't know if maybe that meant the state was more willing to play well with MLC because they recognized their own behaviors. I don't know. I will definitely have to look more at that and see sort of the rationale for when and whether they're partnering with these local leaders. Thank you.
Jess, you're up next if you'd like to unmute.
Sure. So Britt, you know that I think this is a super interesting product, and we've talked several times about it, and it's really cool to see this case study kind of take shape. I have a few questions or things that I think could use a little bit more attention. I'd be curious what other people in the room have to say about them. Two points are on theory and one is on empirics. And so it seems like the theory either in this chapter or in the broader dissertation could sort of benefit from two sort of tensions that you might need to grapple with. And the first is like sort of, you kind of waffle back and forth between the relationship, and this goes to Mike's point a little bit, between sort of symbolic capacity and material capacity, right? And what the sort of theoretical relationship might be. And it strikes me that you could use this opportunity to engage with the weak states versus limited states conversation, right? Because state capacity, right, like is been used in so many different ways to mean a bunch of different things. And the question of state capacity for what always crops up. It might be useful here to sort of think about, like, you know, is it the case that weak states require symbolic capacity to engage in material capacity, but limited states require it's sort of flipped or something like that, right? There's a really potentially interesting theoretical contribution, I think, to be made there that vaccination campaigns could highlight. So that's the first. And the second sort of speaks a little bit to Tonia's point as well. I sort of wanted to follow up on, because I think she sort of started to highlight something. These sort of local partnerships are really interesting and potentially really revelatory, but I do think there needs some additional theorizing about who and when these partnerships are likely to emerge, right? To what extent are these actors actually outside of the state, and when are they co-opted, right? And when does partnering with them actually bolster the state versus give credit to somebody else? Right. Mm-hmm. And so it's not immediately clear that that partnership would necessarily always benefit the state. Right. And I want some theoretical sort of understanding as to why and when that might be the case. And then finally, empirically, right, you seem to be suggesting that the emergence of trust is indicated by the fact that more people were willing to take, that essentially the government is successful and more people were willing to take the vaccine. I'm curious, I didn't see in the paper, but is it possible we have Afrobarometer data for these years for this part of the country? If so, it seems like that could be additional and helpful. And if it's in the paper, I'm sorry, I missed it. I get all the way to the end. But it seems like that could be a supporting empirical contribution.
Yeah, unfortunately, Afrobarometer does not have these years for the DRC. And so I've been trying to use WHO, Doctors Without Borders, and CDC information for this, and it's chaotic, but I will keep at it.
Okay, great.
But thank you, yes, for all the rest of your comments. The material symbolic capacity has just been, I mean, as you know, as we've talked about so many times, they're connected, but also not. And so this is still I'm still confused half the time by what I'm talking about, which isn't a good place to be. So,
but that's your opportunity to theorize, right? That's like an awesome opportunity for an amazing contribution. So if you can struggle through it, I think that like it will be incredibly important in terms of how your work is situated and seen. So I think it's an awesome opportunity, and it's great that you're grappling with it. I'm just saying.
Thank you. I think next.
So I have a few comments. First, legitimacy, and you probably know it goes both ways. So we saw it here and elsewhere that the willingness of the communities to vaccinate is influenced by how much they generally trust the government. And then, of course, if a vaccination campaign is successful or not, the influence is back. I'm not saying that you need to check both, but maybe at least Another thing you mentioned that you want to build a data set. I have a friend, she's working on public health, and her field work is in Malawi. So, and she goes there like every year or so. So I can connect you. Maybe she can help you with that.
Yeah.
And last comment, which is building on what was mentioned about risk. If you connect with rebel group, how does it affect your legitimacy? So there was a case with the COVID vaccine. At the beginning, there were not enough COVID vaccines, but Israel got a lot because it was kind of like a big experiment. And at the end, there was a surplus of like 100,000 that were about to expire in a few weeks. So Israel made an agreement with the Palestinian Authority to send them 100,000 vaccines. And there was already, the agreement was already signed. And then within the Palestinian Authority, some people that they are expired and the government is doing that. So there was again this issue of Palestine versus Israel, and it ended up with the Palestinian Authority wanting to save face and canceling this agreement. And I don't know all the details, just generally I might say, but and at the end the vaccines were sent to South Korea, if I remember right. So this is another, or this is at least one case where political issues affect if you take the vaccines or not.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to be in touch with your friend who does field work in Malawi. But thank you. The other points are great. Yeah, COVID is so interesting because it's global, and so for now I've left it out of my data set and my research because it's such a different disease. It's such a different scale. But I've also, it's like the one I'm sort of putting on the back burner to explore later. And as we move further away from it, I think I'll be able to get a better picture of how it's either very similar or very different from all of these other types of diseases. But yeah, the vaccinations and saving face is very interesting sort of piece of that puzzle. So yeah.
Shannon is up next.
Super cool project, really exciting. One of the things that kind of struck me is this idea that we're looking at local or national collaborating partners are better, right? The example you gave of Ebola seemed to me, it kind of raised the question of like, when there's a cultural reason for refusal to obey with a policy, is someone local better? So I'm not sure if you really considered that cultural component yet.
Okay.
Just because I know trust can kind of be bred from othering and like a misunderstanding, which I know is why partnering with groups can be really, really valuable. So I think just maybe thinking about if there's cultural reasons to have a different level of governance as well.
Yeah. I have stayed away from culture because it's real messy. So thank you for bringing it up. Thank you. No problem. Anytime. Keeping it really succinct when you bring that in.
Or you can at least say like I don't even think you need to like really dive into culture, but like specifically in the context of vaccinations of like practices, like if there's a tension between funeral practices and health guidelines, like how do you, who's the best person to deal with that, which I think is like a whole dissertation chapter.
That might be a separate dissertation.
I'll fully ignore that, but I do think that is a really
I do need to tease out the like what we know is safe practices and what we know is better for how people feel about themselves. So it's a tough one.
It does.
Yes, please.
Thanks for your talk. I've just got two brief things. One for ISA, as a listener who doesn't know anything about what you're talking about, it'd be really interesting to know where you're getting the data from. And so just maybe a slide on that would be useful. And the second thing, in terms of empirics, so I was listening to your argument, and again, it's outside my area, so I'm not fully familiar with the literature and that sort of thing. But two key things jumped out. Firstly, as other people have said, what happened pre-2014 and why did you start your analysis? And your argument is that the partnerships allowed the development of preferred outcomes or beneficial outcomes. Some evidence of how you're controlling for other factors would be useful. I think that could help make your argument stronger. So those spillover effects is the difference between cases get shorter and shorter. So people are learning, their mental models are changing, all of that kind of stuff. And so some evidence as to how your analysis can deep dive in empirics. Account for some of that, I think will make your argument stronger. For some observations.
Thank you.
Great, I've got Dan and then Gustavo.
Yeah, this is from the first, I thought it was a great project.
Yes.
Still do. This isn't so much a recommendation for the conference, but I'm thinking it might be useful to consider this frame as part of it. The situation of normal politics versus abnormal politics.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this interesting literature on how people, especially when faced with emergency circumstances, people become more cooperative, generally, right? And this literature goes back to like the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, and how, everybody begins to pitch in much more than they normally do. And I'm wondering if that provides maybe some additional explanatory rationale for what you're observing.
So with COVID, we didn't see that to be the case. So
that could be a
perception
really of whether it's really an emergency or
right. I think especially in areas that are experiencing pretty frequent endemics and conflict and climate change and all these other natural disasters, what constitutes an emergency is very different from what we would constitute an emergency. And so that is really interesting, is do they even see this as something that they have to address, or is it just something else in a cycle of?
It's obviously very different from when an entire city's on fire around you.
Right, yeah, exactly. Just slightly.
Gustavo?
So I was thinking about legitimacy, right? And then what possible alternative theories or, proto-theories you may have there, okay? So one way of thinking is that it's all about effectiveness, no? So it's like I see good outcomes related to some public policies. They might be just because of luck. It must be because you're putting good effort, competent bureaucracy. I don't care. I just boost my legitimacy because I see good outcomes. And then I, reduce my legitimacy when I see bad outcomes. Second story, I need to come up with something to attribute responsibility, no? So it's like, I will only increase in legitimacy when this is due to good policy and not just because they got lucky and now there is a vaccine and previously there was no vaccine or something like that. The third possibility is that legitimacy is about trustworthiness. It's like, if you have a vaccine of this level of effectiveness, you don't lie, you don't cheat me. You just tell me this is the level of effectiveness. So in that case, situations in which you don't have a good instrument could be very good for legitimacy, because those are great opportunities to show that you are telling the truth. Mm-hmm. So it's like, I have a lot of incentives to cheat you and telling you, hey, this word, but I will tell you the truth. I have a very low effective instrument, and that will boost legitimacy a lot, because essentially legitimacy is mainly about trustworthiness. So again, there might be other theories. Those are the ones that, came to my mind when I was listening to your presentation. But from my perspective, it would be awesome to start, if you can say even an epsilon distinguishing this story, I think it's very valuable, no?
Yeah.
And by the way, this is more general, no? It doesn't only apply to weak states, no? It might, or I don't know, I don't have any hunch on that. It's like, it could apply in different levels or in different variations, in different combinations, for different situations, for different, states and so on and so forth. No? So it's, I would say, so one way of defining a weak state is one that has most of the time very weak instruments to deal with issues. Well, but maybe you can build legitimacy, trying to avoid cheating in some circumstances. It's going to be impossible to do not lie, never lie, but maybe just do not lie all the time.
Right.
I don't know. So it's, anyway, so very disorganized thoughts are just sending everything to you. As I come to my mind, sorry about that.
Mike and then Joyce, and then I'm going to put myself in line.
Could you go back to the slide where you had your hypothesis? Because I want to follow up on that. I do like this hypothesis better than last time you had two hypotheses that the same thing. So this is an improvement. There's one that says the same thing. But I'm struck by a part of this hypothesis, which is strangely precise and specific when hypotheses are generally more vaccination campaigns. It's this relationship you're positing here occurs during vaccination campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a question they used to teach us in IR, I don't know if they still do anymore, about you should always ask about something like this, of what is it an instance? Okay. It goes back to the 40s or 50s, Rosenau. So what is vaccination campaigns an instance of? You start on this a little bit, you've got some discussion in your slides about it's something that needs to be handled quickly. And so that sort of leads to that. But is there something about a vaccination campaign or about the vaccination campaign in this particular setting of a weak state in this after, because this crisis, this disease has been around a while, right? It's been around for a while. So there's already been plenty of failures on the part of government to do that. So that all that's sort of the context. So I know it's sort of an all-encompassing kind of question, but it's still kind of useful. Because to me, the vaccination campaign problem against an epidemic has a couple components that kind of cut in different ways in this case. One is that it's something that's very quick. You can draw on expertise from, so cooperation with other groups would be important. And you can always deflect the kinds of things that Gustavo was talking about. We got a lousy campaign because health organizations, so you can sort of blame them because it wasn't their fault. They didn't have a bad vaccine, and it wasn't their. It wasn't. They didn't get any credit for having the right one the next time. It was what was available. But the vaccination campaign is a very technical kind of issue, okay? And it's also not something where there's an obvious opponent that would rather see you fail because they can make a lot of money off of it. Now, you got a little bit of that built in by working with these rebel groups that kind of either want the government to fail so they can come in and do better, but are working with, so that's a very subtle sort of thing. But it's technical compared to sort of these big economically important kinds of issues. But it also taps into the culture issue. I don't want you to give up on culture entirely, because what's interesting about this is that this was the policy response required here to fix the problem was something that was very culturally sensitive. You were attacking centuries, at least, of practices in how to handle family members once they've died. I mean, that's very emotional, very intense. And if in 2014 the government is coming in and saying you can't do this, that's not going to be received well by anybody in any culture in the world, something that sensitive. but it sounds like it happened and then it worked. You said in 2020, they were still making these sorts of changes. So somehow there was an effect. So in one sense, it was an easy case because it was a technical case that could be handled kind of quickly. In another sense, it was a very difficult case because to solve it, you had to attack these cultural sort of traditions that are very, very difficult to change. So you've got a little bit of the culture, a little bit of the technology. So this is, again, not something to sort of fix by the time of the ISA, but the hypothesis should be more clear. What are the types of situations where being able to work well with global technical experts and with local religious leaders and perhaps with local rivals to political power are all kind of operating at the same time. And then you can sort of expand it out to what are the different sort of configurations, or whether it's just in a weak state or whether this is something that would happen more broadly in terms of this. Like I said before, this is really, really well developing well from your initial start to all this. Very, very good. But there's always sort of ways to dig deeper into this about how to generalize this. And I think that notion of why vaccination campaigns is what you're studying and how typical those are for the kinds of situations that are usually used to build political legitimacy and how atypical they are sort of at the same time. So those are kind of big questions you're going to be dealing with throughout your dissertation sort of project. But again, you don't have to fix it by next week, but it's an interesting lens and not one that most of the IR scholars really focus on. And so it gives you something to work with, but you kind of have to know how you're going to frame that and stuff. So fascinating stuff.
Is it okay if we take our last question and then you can have the final word?
Yeah. Something that Gustavo said about legitimacy occurs to me as, I think it's like you've got it in there, but maybe pulling it apart a little bit would be interesting. And that is that trust is very, very, very hard. Trust/legitimacy is very, very hard to build. But once you actually have it, it's actually kind of hard to take it apart. And it lasts a lot longer. So what are the effects that you have from that they built this, that they're still doing some of the stuff in 2020 and all of that? I think that is a really interesting generalizable kind of a point that might help without going like too deep into culture, but to, have that be a way to touch on how the building of legitimacy. And to me, it's a larger point that would be really great to bring out.
Yeah. You want to ask your question?
Okay. I'll leave it up to you after.
Excellent. Yeah, this is so helpful, not just for this chapter, but for my dissertation in general. So I really appreciate everyone's comments. I think for ISA, I can address about 2 of these, but it's given me a lot to work with moving forward. So thank you guys so much. And yeah.
Very good.